The armed forces of Ukraine successfully counterattacked in the Kharkiv region in the Kupiansk direction. This is according to a report from the Institute for the Study of War. While Russian military bloggers are once again claiming an alleged advance of the Russian army in Kupiansk, according to American analysts, there is no evidence to confirm any Russian army advance in this sector of the front. They also add that Ukrainian Defense Forces are counterattacking from the outskirts of Kupiansk, and fighting continues for the bridge across the Oskol River in Kupiansk-Fuzlovy. According to the Ukrainian military, the Russian army lacks sufficient personnel in this sector of the front, so a breakthrough of the Ukrainian defense in the Kharkiv region is unlikely, although the enemy is actively using guided aerial bombs there. And near Vovchansk, also in the Kharkiv region, Ukrainian drone operators disrupted an enemy attempt to move personnel and supplies closer to the front line in the area of the Tatar forest. First, the armed forces of Ukraine hit a Russian quad bike and then a UAZ vehicle. Both vehicles are beyond repair. Also, one Russian occupier was eliminated and 2 others were wounded.
Such isolated attempts to wedge into our territory, scattered across across such remote areas, testify to one thing, to what we call the traditional methods of conducting operations by the Russian army. That is what we studied a long time ago in the academies. And it is very strange that over the past 30 years, the Russians' approach to conducting operations has not changed, namely the attempts to wedge in by creating the appearance of some kind of offense. But in fact, we see that these are merely attempts to distract our reserves or pin down our reserves in these sectors of the front. That is to say, it is unlikely that the enemy will have the opportunity to conduct any large-scale offensive operations in the Kharkiv direction in the near future.
Russian troops are trying to take control of Lyman in order to use the city as a bridgehead for a further offensive on the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. This was stated by the spokesperson for the Joint Forces Group, Viktor Tregogubov. According to him, without Lyman, an advance towards Slovyansk becomes too risky for Russian troops. Ukraine's defense forces are thwarting attempts to capture the city despite the enemy's continuous attacks. Furthermore, the Ukrainian Armed Forces unmanned systems units are operating with increasing effectiveness, which allows them to contain the advance of Russian troops and strike their positions.
The Russians still have certain advantages. There are also moments where they are encountering serious problems, and they admit it. For example, helicopters, the use of which they have still not managed to effectively organize. Overall, the situation is leveling out in Ukraine's favor, due to both the quantitative and qualitative growth in the number of Ukrainian drones and UAV operators. There are more of them, they're being used more effectively, and the organization of their coordination has become much better compared to the Russian side. Viktor Tregobov, spokesperson for the Joint Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
The Russian infantry stands no chance when the FPV drone pilots of the 128th Separate Mountain Assault Brigade are at work. The invaders may change their location, but that doesn't help them. They try to hide in tree lines, trenches, or abandoned buildings. However, it is all in vain. Ukrainian defenders are eliminating the personnel of the Russian army. And one of the directions, Special Operations Forces fighters quietly and literally in a whisper took the invaders prisoner. During a mission, a Special Forces group discovered individual hideouts of the Russian occupiers. Despite the fact that the positions were well constructed and camouflaged, the SOF operators still detected the enemy and, with weapons at point-blank range, whispered to the Russians not to resist. Thus, the Russian military personnel were taken prisoner without a single shot or even a shout.
Quiet, quiet, quiet. Good. Raise your hands higher. Get up nice and easy now. Get up! Come on. Unload. What's going on there, guys? Everything okay?
A Russian MLRS in the Donetsk region was destroyed by operators from the Lazars Group strike UAV unit of the National Guard of Ukraine. This time, the target was a BM-27 Uragan, loaded with ammunition, which was heading to a firing position. MLRS remained one of the priority targets for the defense forces. For a month, Ukrainian intelligence gathered information about the area where the enemy had set up firing positions. After confirming the coordinates, heavy UAVs were sent to the target. 2 precise drops and the vehicle caught fire, followed by the detonation of the ammunition load. The rockets were flying out almost horizontally, creating a spectacular and destructive scene. And since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has already lost more than 1,451,000 soldiers. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the Defense Forces eliminated 1,240 Russian occupiers just in the last 24 hours. They also destroyed 5 Russian tanks, 4 armored combat vehicles, 55 artillery systems, and 4 multiple-launch rocket systems. They destroyed 5 air defense systems and 12 ground-based robotic complexes. In addition, they turned nearly 400 units of enemy automotive equipment into scrap metal.
Vyacheslav Potapenko, Deputy Director of the National Institute for Strategic Studies, is already with us on a live feed. Welcome.
A very pleasant morning to you all.
Good morning.
Vyacheslav, Russia has struck Ukraine with ballistic missiles and drones for the 3rd time this week. They are trying to strike the capital. In Kyiv, there are casualties, there are injured, there is destruction. The night was truly terrifying. And all of this resembles agony, some kind of hysteria. What do you think Putin is trying to say and signal to whom with these shellings of Kyiv in particular?
Well, it seems to me that there's a war going on, and right now, certain, so to speak, logistics facilities are being destroyed, which are hitting, so to speak, the population. This is consumption, this is online purchases, store deliveries, these are gas stations, these are other logistics facilities. In other words, the war has moved from the stage of war at the front and, so to speak, general intimidating strikes on the territory of Ukraine into, well, a heavier phase. Well, in fact, Kyiv is a frontline city, and, not just Kyiv. And, infrastructure is being destroyed. Well, I understand that they intend to continue doing this. So this is like a new phase of the war.
Terrorizing the civilian population with an attempt to intimidate, with an attempt to make people think about the fact that probably we don't want to live like this anymore. An attempt to break society apart. Doesn't it seem that way to you?
Well, this is war. It's more than just terror. Well, war is pressure on the entire population of the country you're at war with, and intimidation, naturally, not just targeted, but of the entire population as a whole, as a result of which they, leave for abroad and so on. There. Well, yeah. Well, absolutely. Well, Ukraine is also carrying out strikes deep into the territory of the Russian Federation, also creating problems for logistics, this is war. It's war. It's just that we've reached another level of escalation. It's become broader. And the rear, it's feeling this war much more, both in Ukraine and in Russia, than it was, let's say, a year ago. Yeah. So the war is escalating and supplies are increasing. If you analyze the data on supplies, the missiles, they aren't just Russian. They are being supplied by their allies. Yeah. Therefore, the war is expanding. Its geography is expanding. The number of strikes is increasing. The war is, it's growing, and more of the population is being involved.
Vyacheslav, let's talk about what the situation looks like against this backdrop. If not the negotiation track, then what we are hearing about it. Ukraine is ready for any negotiation formats that are capable of bringing a just and lasting peace closer. President Volodymyr Zelensky stated this. According to him, representatives of Ukraine are in contact with the White House every day. We'll listen and continue the conversation.
At the meeting in Washington, we talked about how to create new circumstances so that there could be real diplomacy. We are trying to implement all of this. Budanov, Umarov, Arakamiya, and Kislitsia each reported on their own elements of the negotiation track, where we stand in the negotiations, and what is happening in Moscow regarding their attitude toward negotiations. We will be ready for all meeting formats. We are counting on Witkoff and Kushner being active now in August. Work is also continuing with other partners, particularly in the Gulf countries, who can support our diplomatic efforts and our security needs.
Vyacheslav, how do you see the development of possible scenarios? Various things were mentioned, yes. And perhaps, by the end of this year, the parties might reach something, and so on. Yes, but perhaps, without wearing rose-colored glasses, How do you view the probabilities that the parties could actually come to something with the help of our, obviously, partners from the side of the United States of America itself?
Well, considering that the Gulf countries are involved in the war, our partners in the form of the United States of America are also already involved in the war in the Persian Gulf. There it is. And the group of countries that are opposing them, that's Russia, Iran, Korea, and to some extent China, which has stated that it won't let Russia lose. So, well, like this could, well, if we're talking about some kind of peace negotiations, it would have to be, so to speak, a peace conference with the participation of, well, the countries I named, plus the European Union, the states, and so on. These are huge global processes, a new world order. I think that the parties aren't even close to being ready for this. The question isn't even being framed that way. If we're talking about a ceasefire along the line of contact, well, the problem is that the line of contact has disappeared. The maps that are being drawn in different countries, they already differ by like 3 villages in one direction, 3 in the other. I mean, we're talking about some kind of interpenetration zone that's like several dozen kilometers wide, and it's already very difficult to put up barbed wire and a border guard somewhere there. Exactly. So, well, new approaches are needed here, but a truce is possible. But again, it cannot be achieved, so to speak, through negotiations in a 2 or 3 party format. Because on one hand, the Russian Federation is participating in this already global war on the side of the global south. And, well, it itself also cannot agree to any terms. Therefore, again, a truce, a freeze, with the goal of later moving on to some kind of global negotiations regarding various wars on different fronts. This is possible, but it doesn't depend entirely on Ukraine and Russia. It also depends on the USA and on Iran and on Korea, on China and on European partners, Great Britain. That is, a huge pool of countries is involved. Therefore, undoubtedly, some consultations are taking place. Everyone is trying, so to speak, on one hand to increase escalation, and on the other hand, not to increase the area. Well, you remember at the beginning, back in 1922 to 23, everyone was saying that the war shouldn't go beyond the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine wasn't given the opportunity to carry out strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation. In 2024, when there was, yes, this whole operation in Kursk, that all changed already. Well, in the war is expanding. I mean, I am very, well, so to speak, skeptical that this is possible. It's another matter that if the money and ammunition run out, the intensity of the conflict might simply drop to the level of, say, 2020 or 2016. But considering the availability of long-range assets, which in principle everyone is using, deep into the territory, both Russia and Ukraine, then how can you control that? And how can it, well, I mean, it's enough to send a couple of drones once a month for the war to continue indefinitely. Therefore, I am quite skeptical about that possibility.
Vyacheslav, what do you think, as of today, considering the sanctions and the economic situation of the Russian Federation, how much longer is Putin capable of continuing this war in terms of time? He has certain reserves, that's clear. There are partners like North Korea who are helping him with weaponry. But what kind of timeframes is he still prepared to go for?
Well, if we remember that China has stated it will not let Russia lose, and if we view China as the rear guard in the war of Iran and Russia against, respectively, the Gulf countries, Israel, the USA, Ukraine, and the European Union, then, well, this could last a very long time. If China, so to speak, switches to the side of the USA, imposes an embargo, closes its borders, and does all the rest, well, then the Russian Federation probably won't be able to fight for long, maybe a year. But if not, well, that's an unlikely scenario. And in all other cases, we are talking in essence about a global confrontation, effectively a world war. Well, sort of a cold world war with hot fronts. And here, the resources, well, so to speak, are close to inexhaustible for all sides. After all, Ukraine's own resources ran out a long time ago. But, nevertheless, Ukraine is quite successfully repelling Russian attacks, and what's more, it's attacking their territory. Well, and therefore, this is very much a question not related to the capabilities of one country, because the war has become global.
Yes, and we understand that we need to increase pressure on the Russian Federation against the backdrop of all the situations that are taking place. And so the United States of America has expanded sanctions against Russia, including units of the armed forces of the Russian Federation in the package of the Ministry of Defense. The measures went into effect back on July 24th, but they were only officially announced now. The new restrictions include, in particular, the Russian ground forces, the main missile and artillery directorate of the Ministry of Defense, the Directorate for Advanced Inter-Service Research and Special Projects, as well as the Material and Technical Support Center. And, in addition, the sanctions affected several Russian citizens, as well as representatives from Malaysia, North Korea, Taiwan, Syria, and Iran, whom Washington considers to be involved in supporting the Russian military-industrial complex. Are these sanctions enough, in your opinion? What could be done now? What kind of sanctions would be needed to truly exert pressure that would be felt in the Kremlin?
Well, if we're talking about the Russian side as a separate entity, it would be nice if Russia actually stopped selling oil. But given the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the shortage of oil supplies from both Iran and the Gulf countries, well, that's quite unlikely, because it would hit the European, American, and Chinese economies all at once. That is, all developed economies very hard. Yeah, but it is the only way. So, well, the situation is, so to speak, complicated. Well, shutting down Russia's export sectors so that it starts receiving less money. Yeah, but in essence, this will push it into greater dependence on the countries of the global south, primarily on China. That's why, in a way, the United States threatens this. But they are implementing it quite cautiously because, well, as a matter of fact, right now we see that the idea of tearing Russia away from China has, in fact, failed. And all this tightening of sanctions and pressure on Russia and the new position of the United States of America is most likely connected to the realization of the new realities that you and I are talking about. That is, that there is a global confrontation. Russia's on the other side. And, well, indeed, it needs to be pressured. And one needs to, as it were, focus on, after all, military actions and pressure on the economy of the Russian Federation as part of that bloc which the United States and the European Union are opposing. Well, that's why, yes, they will try to target export industries. Well, there are quite a few of them in Russia, besides oil. That includes grain, gas, timber, various polymetals, and fertilizers. Exactly. But all of this is usually transported by sea. Therefore, it's about cutting off, in essence, the possibility of export by sea. This is, well, sort of the name tool. And also in the digital sphere, things like licenses, technologies, access to various technologies, updates for software, the fleet of civilian aircraft, automobiles, various gadgets, and so on. But this leads to the substitution of Chinese products, which, in principle, are currently capable of meeting the needs of the Russian Federation. So this drift of Russia towards China is really an inevitable consequence of the sanctions policy that has been imposed on them by the West. And that is what creates huge problems for the U.S. Therefore, well, we live in a very complex world where, unfortunately, the Russia-Ukraine war is not some isolated event that can, well, sort of resolved at one's own discretion.
Vyacheslav, tell me, can we, well, not even model, but simply predict a certain scenario of events in which, this Putin war, the war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, will bring more problems than benefits to China itself and the nearby countries bordering both China and the Russian Federation? To look at it this way, at what point will Putin's inadequacy and these actions, where he simply refuses to see that he needs to wrap things up, become so unbearable that it will lead to the realization that if he doesn't do it himself, Then China, perhaps through the president of Kazakhstan, will somehow hint that, Vladimir, it's time for you to think about ending this senseless war, which no one understands the purpose of.
Well, theoretically, such conditions are probably possible, but that could only happen if, let's say, China and European countries reach some kind of unity and understanding on how they won't confront each other, but trade. And Europe somehow moves away from this confrontation between the USA and China. And then Russia would turn out to be a necessary transit territory. There! And then, well, it would be in China's interest for this war to end, and for the confrontation between Russia and Europe to end as well. Theoretically it's possible, but it absolutely doesn't depend on the personal qualities of, say, some person or group of people who are in charge, or on some events that are happening 7,000 kilometers away from the Chinese border. Well, it'll depend only on China's trade and geopolitical interests. If they see, that they need Russia as a bridge to a friendly Europe, well, then yes. Well, in all other cases, it seems to me that they, in general, really don't care what happens 7,000 kilometers away, by and large. Yes, they don't want a global nuclear war. They have always stated that. They're stating it now, and they will continue to state it. And, well, in essence, maybe that's the only thing that has been holding Putin back from using tactical nuclear weapons for the last few years. That factor exists. And everything else, well, I don't yet see, that they, on one hand, have such a volume of tools. Yes, maybe over the years, Russia's dependence on China will grow, and their role in Russian politics will increase, and they will be able to control Russia more. But that's not immediate,